John Deere was born in 1804 in Rutland, Vermont, the son of a tailor who disappeared at sea when the boy was 4 years old. He was not an inventor by training, not an engineer, not a man of wealth or formal education. He was a blacksmith, apprenticed at 15, learning to shape iron over fire in the workshops of small New England towns. By his early 30s, Deere had married, fathered children, and accumulated debt. The Panic of 1837 had collapsed credit across the Northeast, and Vermont offered little opportunity for a craftsman struggling to feed a family. In 1836, Deere left his wife and children behind and traveled west to Illinois, intending to send for them once he had established himself. He arrived in Grand Detour, a settlement of fewer than a dozen families along the Rock River, about 100 miles west of Chicago. The region was filling with settlers from the east, families who had sold farms in exhausted soil and come west for land that was said to be fertile beyond measure. The prairie stretched flat and unbroken, covered in grasses that grew taller than a man. The soil beneath was black, thick with organic matter accumulated over thousands of years. It was soil that promised abundant crops, and the federal government was selling it for little more than $1 an acre. Farmers arrived with their families, their tools, and their eastern plows, and they began to break the prairie. The plows failed. Eastern plows were designed for the light, sandy soils of New England and the Atlantic states, soils that crumbled and fell away from the moldboard as it turned the furrow. Prairie soil was different. It was dense, heavy, and wet with subsurface moisture. It clung to the iron moldboard in thick layers, packing onto the surface until the plow could no longer cut. Every few feet, the farmer had to stop, scrape the soil away with a paddle, and resume. Breaking an acre could take days. Some settlers gave up and returned east. Others planted only small gardens near their cabins and waited, hoping someone would solve the problem. Deere recognized the issue within weeks of his arrival. Farmers brought him their plows for sharpening and repair, and they described the problem in practical terms. The soil stuck because the iron was rough and porous. It held moisture, and the soil adhered to it. Deere understood that the solution was not a stronger plow or a sharper edge. The solution was a surface that would not hold the soil. He needed a moldboard that was smooth and polished, one that would allow the heavy prairie earth to slide away as the plow moved forward. In 1837, Deere obtained a broken steel saw blade from a local sawmill. Steel was rare on the frontier, expensive and difficult to obtain, but it had properties that cast iron did not. It could be polished to a high shine, and it was less porous. Deere shaped the saw blade into a moldboard, cutting and bending the steel over his forge, fitting it to a wooden frame and attaching a share at the front. He tested the plow in a field near Grand Detour. The steel's surface cut through the prairie sod, and the soil slid away without sticking. The plow worked. Word spread among the farming communities along the Rock River. Deere made more plows, each one shaped by hand, each moldboard polished smooth. He sold them to neighbors, and those neighbors spoke to others. Demand grew. By 1838, Deere was producing 10 plows a year. By 1841, he was making 75. He hired assistants and expanded his workshop, but the work remained slow and limited by the availability of steel. Steel had to be imported from England, shipped across the Atlantic, transported by canal and river to Illinois. It was expensive, and supply was unreliable. Deere could not produce plows faster than he could obtain steel. In 1843, he found a supplier in Pittsburgh. A rolling mill there agreed to produce steel sheets to his specifications, flat panels that could be shaped into moldboards without the need to hammer and grind salvaged saw blades. The arrangement reduced costs and increased production. Deere made agreements with distributors, men who would carry his plows to farming towns across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. He marked each plow with his name, a guarantee of quality that became recognized among farmers. By 1846, Deere was producing more than 1,000 plows a year. Grand Detour was too small and too isolated to support further growth. The Rock River was shallow and unreliable for transport, and the town had no connection to the expanding railroad network. Deere needed access to rail lines and to the Mississippi River, which would allow him to ship plows south into Iowa and Missouri and west along the expanding frontier. In 1847, he moved his operation to Moline, Illinois, a town on the Mississippi with access to both river transport and the new railroad lines being constructed across the state. He built a factory near the riverbank, installed steam-powered equipment, and reorganized production to increase output. The move to Moline marked the transition from craft production to industrial manufacturing. Deere no longer made plows himself. He supervised workers who operated machinery that cut, bent, and polished steel in repeating sequences. The factory could produce plows faster than any blacksmith, and the cost per unit dropped. Deere sold plows through a network of dealers, men who operated stores in county seats and farming towns, who bought inventory in bulk and resold it to local farmers. The dealers provided credit to farmers, allowing them to purchase plows in the spring and pay after the harvest. Deere provided credit to the dealers, extending loans that would be repaid once the plows were sold. The system allowed for growth, but it also created risk. If harvests failed, farmers could not pay dealers. If dealers could not pay, Deere could not cover his costs. The 1850s brought rapid expansion. The population of Illinois doubled. Iowa and Kansas opened to settlement. Railroads pushed west, carrying settlers and supplies into regions that had been inaccessible a decade earlier. The demand for plows grew faster than Deere could supply them. He expanded the Moline factory, adding capacity for new products. Farmers needed more than plows. They needed cultivators to break up soil between rows of corn, harrows to smooth fields after plowing, planters to sow seed in even lines. Deere began manufacturing these tools, each one designed to work in prairie soil, each one sold through the same dealer network that distributed his plows. By 1857, the factory in Moline was producing more than 10,000 plows a year, along with thousands of cultivators, harrows, and other implements. Deere employed over 100 workers. He had established a brand that farmers across the Midwest recognized and trusted. But the growth had come at a cost. The credit system that had enabled expansion had also created dependency. Deere owed money to steel suppliers, to banks, to investors who had financed the factory expansion. The dealers owed money to Deere. The farmers owed money to the dealers. The entire structure depended on continuous growth and reliable harvests. In 1857, a financial panic swept through the American economy. Banks failed, credit collapsed, and prices for agricultural products dropped. Farmers could not pay their debts. Dealers defaulted. Deere's factory faced insolvency. The panic of 1857 forced John Deere to confront the fragility of his credit network. Dealers across the Midwest had borrowed heavily to stock inventory, and when grain prices collapsed, farmers could not pay for the equipment they had purchased on credit. The dealers, in turn, could not pay Deere. The company's ledgers showed thousands of dollars in outstanding debts, money that existed on paper but could not be collected. Deere had expanded production based on projected sales, and now the factory sat partially idle while creditors demanded payment. He negotiated extensions with his suppliers, restructured loans, and pressed his dealers to collect what they could. Some debts were written off entirely. Others were settled for partial payment. The company survived, but barely. The experience taught Deere that growth without financial discipline was unsustainable. He began requiring larger down payments from dealers and shortening the terms of credit. He reduced production to match actual orders rather than anticipated demand. The changes stabilized the company's finances but limited its ability to expand rapidly. By the time the economy recovered in the early 1860s, Deere's business was solvent but cautious. Then the Civil War began, and the calculation changed entirely. The war created immediate demand for food. The Union Army required enormous quantities of grain to feed soldiers and horses. European harvests failed in 1861 and 1862, and Britain turned to American wheat to feed its population. Prices for corn and wheat rose sharply. Farmers who had struggled through the depression of the late 1850s suddenly found themselves with profitable crops and access to cash. They purchased equipment, expanded their acreage, and invested in machinery that would allow them to produce more with less labor. Thousands of young men had left farms to join the army, and those who remained needed tools that would compensate for the missing workers. Deere's factory ran at full capacity. The company sold plows, cultivators, and harrows as fast as they could be produced. Steel suppliers, now focused on wartime production of weapons and railroad materials, struggled to meet demand, but Deere secured contracts and maintained his supply lines. By 1863, the company was producing more than 15,000 plows annually. Revenue increased, debts were paid down, and profits accumulated. John Deere, now nearly 60 years old, began to step back from daily operations. His son, Charles Deere, took on greater responsibility for managing production and sales. Charles Deere was 30 years old in 1863, methodical and financially conservative, in ways his father had not always been. He had worked in the company since his 20s, learning the business from the ground up, and he understood both the opportunities and the dangers of the agricultural equipment trade. He recognized that the wartime boom would not last. When the war ended, demand would fall, prices would drop, and the company would need to be prepared. He pushed for tighter financial controls, more rigorous management of dealer credit, and diversification of the product line to reduce dependence on any single item. The war ended in 1865, and as Charles had predicted, agricultural prices fell. The army no longer needed vast quantities of grain, and European production recovered. Farmers who had expanded during the war found themselves with more capacity than the market required. Equipment sales declined. Some manufacturers, particularly smaller operations that had grown rapidly during the boom, collapsed. Deere and Company survived because it had maintained financial discipline and because it had built a reputation that extended beyond a single product. Farmers knew the Deere name, and they trusted that a plow or cultivator bearing that name would perform as promised. The post-war years brought a new phase of Western expansion. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened millions of acres of public land to settlement, and the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, made it possible to reach territories that had previously been inaccessible. Nebraska, Kansas, and Dakota Territory filled with settlers, many of them immigrants from Germany, Scandinavia, and Central Europe. These were not subsistence farmers. They came to produce grain for market, to grow wheat and corn that would be shipped east by rail to Chicago and then distributed across the country and overseas. They needed equipment immediately, and they needed it in large quantities. Deere expanded its dealer network into these new territories, establishing relationships with merchants in towns that had not existed 5 years earlier. The company introduced new products designed specifically for the conditions of the Great Plains. The soils there were different from those in Illinois, lighter and drier, and the climate was harsher. Deere's engineers, working in the Moline factory, modified plow designs to handle these conditions, adjusting the shape of the moldboard and the angle of the share. The company also began manufacturing steel plows with interchangeable parts, components that could be replaced in the field without returning the entire plow to a dealer. This was a significant innovation. A farmer working miles from the nearest town could not afford to lose days of plowing because a share broke. If he could replace the share himself, he could continue working. By 1870, Deere & Company was producing more than 30,000 plows a year, along with a wide range of cultivators, harrows, wagons, and other implements. The company employed several hundred workers in Moline, and its products were sold through hundreds of dealers across the Midwest and Great Plains. John Deere, now in his mid-60s, had largely retired from active management. Charles Deere ran the company, and he ran it with an emphasis on stability and incremental growth. He avoided the aggressive credit practices that had nearly destroyed the company in the 1850s. He insisted that dealers maintain adequate capital and that they collect debts promptly. He invested profits back into the business, expanding factory capacity and improving production methods, but he did so cautiously, without overextending. The 1870s brought new competition. Other manufacturers, recognizing the profitability of the agricultural equipment market, entered the industry. Some were small operations, blacksmiths who had begun making plows in local workshops and had expanded into regional producers. Others were larger companies, established manufacturers of industrial machinery who saw agriculture as a new market. The most significant of these was McCormick, a Chicago-based company that had built its reputation on the mechanical reaper, a horse-drawn machine that cut grain far faster than a man with a scythe. McCormick had grown rapidly during the Civil War, and by the 1870s, it was the dominant manufacturer of reapers in the United States. Deere did not manufacture reapers. The company's expertise was in soil working equipment, plows and cultivators, not harvesting machinery. Charles Deere recognized that this was a limitation. Farmers needed both types of equipment, and if Deere could not supply reapers, they would purchase them from McCormick or another competitor. The dealer who sold the farmer a reaper would also be in a position to sell that farmer a plow, and Deere would lose the sale. In 1875, Deere attempted to enter the reaper market by acquiring a small manufacturer in Illinois. The experiment failed. The reapers were poorly designed, prone to breakage, and farmers rejected them. Deere withdrew from the reaper business and returned its focus to plows and cultivators. The failure reinforced a lesson that would shape the company's strategy for the next several decades. Deere was not a manufacturer of all types of farm equipment. It was a specialist in ground-working tools, and it would remain so. The company would compete by making the best plows and cultivators available, by building a brand that farmers trusted, and by maintaining a distribution network that could reach even the most remote farming communities. This focus allowed Deere to avoid direct competition with McCormick and other reaper manufacturers, but it also meant that the company's growth was limited to the expansion of plowed acreage. If the frontier stopped expanding, Deere's growth would stop as well. The 1880s marked a period of consolidation and incremental improvement rather than dramatic expansion. The frontier was filling, but it had not yet closed. Settlers continued to move into the Dakotas, western Kansas, and Nebraska, but the pace had slowed compared to the rush of the previous 2 decades. Deere and Company focused on refining its products and strengthening its position in established markets. The company introduced the Gilpin sulky plow in 1875, a riding plow that allowed the farmer to sit rather than walk behind the implement. This reduced fatigue and increased the amount of land a farmer could work in a day. The sulky plow became one of Deere's most successful products, and it established a pattern the company would follow for decades. Take an existing tool, improve its design, and make it more efficient. Charles Deere expanded the Moline factory complex, adding new buildings and installing more advanced machinery. The company employed nearly 1,000 workers by 1886, and production had grown to include a wide array of implements. Plows of various sizes and designs, cultivators for different crops, disc harrows that could break up hard soil more effectively than traditional spike-tooth harrows, and grain drills that planted seed in precise rows. Each product was designed to solve a specific problem that farmers faced, and each was built to last. Deere's reputation depended on durability. A plow that broke after a season was worthless to a farmer who might be hundreds of miles from a dealer, and a reputation for poor quality would spread quickly through rural communities where word of mouth determined which brands succeeded and which failed. John Deere died in 1886 at the age of 82. He had not been actively involved in the company for more than a decade, but his name remained on every product, and his legacy shaped the company's identity. Charles Deere took full control, but he was not alone in managing the business. He brought in experienced managers, men who understood manufacturing, finance, and distribution. He also began to think beyond the immediate challenges of production and sales. The agricultural equipment industry was changing. Manufacturers were growing larger, and competition was intensifying. Small regional producers were being absorbed or driven out of business. The survivors were companies that could produce at scale, that had access to capital, and that controlled distribution networks large enough to reach farmers across multiple states. In 1888, Charles Deere reorganized the company's distribution system. Previously, Deere had sold equipment through independent dealers, merchants who operated stores in farming towns and who carried products from multiple manufacturers. This system had worked during the early years of expansion, but it had limitations. Dealers were not loyal to any single manufacturer. They sold whatever equipment they could obtain and whatever they believed would appeal to local farmers. If a competitor offered better terms or a more attractive product, the dealer would switch brands. Deere had no control over how its products were presented to customers, and it had no direct relationship with the farmers who used its equipment. Charles Deere began establishing branch houses, company-owned distribution centers located in major cities across the Midwest and Great Plains. These branch houses stocked Deere equipment, provided credit to local dealers, and employed salesmen who traveled to rural areas promoting Deere products. The branch house system gave Deere greater control over its distribution network and allowed the company to respond more quickly to changes in demand. It also required significant capital investment. Each branch house had to be built, staffed, and stocked with inventory. The system would not generate profits immediately, but Charles believed it was necessary for long-term survival. The 1890s brought economic turmoil. Agricultural prices fell as global production increased and as railroads opened new farming regions in Canada, Argentina, and Australia. American farmers, particularly those on the Great Plains, found themselves producing grain that could not be sold at a profit. Mortgage debt, accumulated during the expansion of the 1870s and 1880s, became unbearable. Foreclosures increased, and rural banks failed. The Panic of 1893 triggered a nationwide depression that lasted for years. Farmers stopped buying equipment. They made do with old plows and cultivators, repairing them as best they could, postponing purchases until conditions improved. Deere and Company faced declining sales and mounting pressure from creditors. The branch house system, which had required substantial investment, now represented a financial burden. Charles Deere reduced production, laid off workers, and tightened credit terms. He refused to abandon the branch houses, believing that the system would prove its value once the economy recovered. The company survived the Depression by drawing on reserves accumulated during the profitable years of the 1880s and by maintaining its reputation among farmers. When a farmer did have money to spend on equipment, he was more likely to purchase from a manufacturer he trusted, and Deere had spent decades building that trust. The Depression ended in the late 1890s, and agriculture entered a new period of prosperity. Gold discoveries in Alaska and South Africa increased the money supply, prices rose, and farmers who had survived the hard years found themselves able to invest again. Deere's sales recovered, and the branch house system began to demonstrate its effectiveness. The company could now coordinate production and distribution more efficiently than competitors who relied on independent dealers. When demand for a particular implement increased in Kansas, the branch house in Kansas City could order directly from the Moline factory, and the equipment could be shipped within days. Independent dealers, by contrast, had to place orders through wholesalers, a process that took weeks and that often resulted in stock shortages during peak seasons. Charles Deere also began to address a limitation that had constrained the company since the 1870s. Deere manufactured plows and cultivators, but it did not manufacture harvesting equipment. Farmers still purchased reapers, binders, and mowers from other companies, primarily from McCormick and International Harvester, a massive conglomerate formed in 1902 through the merger of McCormick and several other manufacturers. International Harvester controlled nearly 80% of the harvesting equipment market, and it was beginning to use that dominance to pressure dealers. Harvester insisted that dealers who wanted to carry its reapers and binders could not sell competing brands of plows and cultivators. This threatened Deere's distribution network. If dealers were forced to choose between Harvester's harvesting equipment and Deere's plows, many would choose Harvester because harvesting equipment generated higher sales volumes. Charles Deere responded by acquiring small manufacturers of harvesting equipment and by developing Deere's own line of mowers, binders, and hay rakes. The products were not as advanced as Harvester's, and they did not sell as well, but they allowed Deere to offer dealers a complete line of equipment. A dealer could now purchase everything he needed from Deere, and he would not be dependent on Harvester. This strategy required significant investment in new factories, new engineering staff, and new production methods. Harvesting equipment was mechanically complex, far more so than plows, and Deere had no experience manufacturing it. The company hired engineers from other firms, purchased patents, and built new facilities in Moline and in other locations. By 1907, Deere & Company was producing a full range of agricultural implements: plows, cultivators, harrows, planters, mowers, binders, hay rakes, and wagons. The company operated multiple factories, employed thousands of workers, and sold its products through a network of branch houses and dealers that extended from Ohio to the Rocky Mountains. Charles Deere had transformed the company from a regional plow manufacturer into one of the largest agricultural equipment producers in the United States. He had done so through careful financial management, strategic investment in distribution, and a willingness to expand into new product categories when competition required it. Charles Deere died in 1907 at the age of 74. His son, William Butterworth, took control of the company. Butterworth had married Charles Deere's daughter and had worked in the business for years, but he lacked his father-in-law's deep understanding of agriculture and manufacturing. He was a capable administrator, but he was not a visionary. Under his leadership, the company continued to grow, but it did so by following the path Charles Deere had established rather than by innovating. The company expanded its product line, opened new branch houses, and increased production capacity, but it did not anticipate the transformation that was about to reshape American agriculture entirely. The transformation came from an unexpected direction. In the first decade of the 20th century, gasoline-powered tractors began appearing on American farms. These were not the first attempts to replace horses with mechanical power. Steam traction engines had been used since the 1880s, massive machines that could pull plows and power threshing equipment, but they were expensive, difficult to operate, and impractical for most farmers. They were used primarily by large-scale wheat producers in the Dakotas and by custom threshing crews who traveled from farm to farm during harvest season. The average farmer, working a few hundred acres of corn and wheat, had no use for a steam engine. He relied on horses. Gasoline tractors were different. They were smaller than steam engines, simpler to operate, and they did not require the constant attention that a steam boiler demanded. Early models were unreliable, prone to breakdowns, and still too expensive for most farmers, but they represented a possibility that had not existed before. A farmer with a tractor could work more land with less labor. He did not need to feed horses year-round, did not need to devote acreage to growing hay and oats, and did not need to spend hours each day caring for animals. The tractor could plow, cultivate, and haul, and it could do so faster than a team of horses. Several small manufacturers began producing gasoline tractors in the early 1900s. The most successful of these was the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company in Waterloo, Iowa, which introduced the Waterloo Boy tractor in 1914. The Waterloo Boy was a simple, rugged machine, designed to be affordable and easy to repair. It sold well among Iowa and Illinois farmers, and other manufacturers took notice. International Harvester, recognizing the potential threat to its business, developed its own line of tractors and began selling them through its established dealer network. Ford Motor Company, which had revolutionized automobile manufacturing, announced in 1917 that it would produce a light, inexpensive tractor called the Fordson. Henry Ford intended to do for farm tractors what he had done for automobiles: produce them in such volume that the price would fall within reach of the average farmer. Deere & Company did not manufacture tractors. William Butterworth and the company's senior managers watched the tractor market develop, but they did not move to enter it. The reasons for this hesitation were partly financial and partly strategic. Developing a tractor required substantial investment in engineering and manufacturing, and Deere's expertise was in horse-drawn implements, not engines. The company had no experience designing or building internal combustion engines, and entering the tractor business would require hiring new engineers, building new factories, and establishing new supply chains. Butterworth was cautious, and the company's board of directors was divided. Some believed that tractors were a passing novelty, that horses would remain the primary source of farm power for decades. Others recognized that tractors represented the future, but they argued that Deere should wait until the technology matured before committing resources. The decision to wait proved costly. By 1918, thousands of tractors were operating on American farms, and the number was growing rapidly. Ford began mass-producing the Fordson in 1917, and by 1920, the company was selling more than 60,000 tractors per year at a price of less than $400. International Harvester responded by reducing the price of its tractors and by expanding production. The tractor market was becoming a battleground between two of the largest industrial companies in the United States, and Deere was not participating. The company's dealers noticed the shift before the managers in Moline did. Farmers were asking about tractors, and dealers who could not offer them were losing customers to competitors who could. Letters arrived at the Moline headquarters from dealers across the Midwest, urging the company to develop a tractor or to acquire a manufacturer that already produced one. Butterworth finally acted in 1918. Deere and Company purchased the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company for $2 million, acquiring not just the Waterloo Boy tractor but also the engineering staff and the manufacturing facilities needed to produce it. The acquisition gave Deere entry into the tractor market, but it did not give the company a competitive product. The Waterloo Boy was adequate, but it was not advanced. It was heavy, difficult to maneuver, and it lacked features that farmers increasingly expected, such as a power takeoff that could drive other equipment. Ford's Fordson, by contrast, was lighter, easier to operate, and significantly cheaper. Deere sold Waterloo Boy tractors through its dealer network, but sales were limited. The company was competing against Ford and International Harvester, both of which had greater resources, more advanced engineering, and established reputations in the tractor market. Deere's engineers in Waterloo began working on a new tractor design. The goal was to create a machine that would be more reliable than the Waterloo Boy, more versatile than the Fordson, and affordable enough to compete with both. The result was the Model D, introduced in 1923. The Model D was a two-cylinder tractor, a design that became Deere's signature for the next several decades. The two-cylinder engine was simpler than the four-cylinder engines used by most competitors, which meant it had fewer parts that could break, and it was easier for farmers to repair. The engine produced a distinctive sound, a slow, rhythmic exhaust note that farmers could hear from a distance. The Model D was heavier than the Fordson, which gave it better traction in heavy soil, and it was built with components that could be replaced in the field. The Model D sold well. Farmers appreciated its durability and its simplicity, and Deere's dealers promoted it aggressively. By 1925, Deere was selling more than 4,000 tractors per year, a modest figure compared to Ford and International Harvester, but enough to establish the company as a credible competitor. The tractor market, however, was becoming increasingly difficult. Ford, frustrated by low profit margins and by declining sales, withdrew from the tractor business in 1928. International Harvester, meanwhile, continued to dominate, controlling nearly half of the American tractor market and using its size to pressure competitors on price. Deere responded by expanding its tractor line. The Model D was designed for large-scale grain farms, but many farmers operated smaller acreage and needed a lighter, less expensive machine. In 1928, Deere introduced the Model C, later redesigned and renamed the Model GP, a general-purpose tractor that could perform a wider range of tasks. The GP could be fitted with cultivators, planters, and other implements, allowing it to replace horses for row crop work. It was not as successful as the Model D, partly because International Harvester's Farmall tractor, introduced in 1924, had already captured much of the row crop market. The Farmall was better designed, more versatile, and backed by Harvester's massive distribution network. Deere's position in the late 1920s was uncomfortable. The company had entered the tractor market, but it was not a leader. It sold a respectable number of machines, but it lacked the engineering sophistication and the manufacturing scale of International Harvester. The company's strength remained in horse-drawn implements, plows and cultivators that were still used by millions of farmers who had not yet adopted tractors. This created a dilemma. Deere needed to invest heavily in tractor development if it wanted to compete with Harvester, But such investment would divert resources from the horse-drawn implement business that still generated the majority of the company's revenue. Butterworth and the company's managers chose a middle path, investing enough in tractors to remain competitive but not enough to challenge harvesters' dominance. Then the economy collapsed. The stock market crash of 1929 triggered a depression that devastated American agriculture. Crop prices, which had been falling since the early 1920s, plummeted. Farmers who had borrowed money to purchase land and equipment during the prosperous years of World War I found themselves unable to make payments. Banks foreclosed on farms across the Midwest and Great Plains. Thousands of families lost their land. Those who managed to hold on stopped buying equipment entirely. Tractor sales fell by more than half between 1929 and 1932. Sales of plows, cultivators, and other implements collapsed even further. Deere and Company faced the worst financial crisis in its history. Revenue dropped from $70 million in 1929 to $20 million in 1932. The company laid off thousands of workers, closed factories, and suspended dividends to shareholders. The branch houses, which had been built at great expense during the previous decades, now represented fixed costs that the company could not support. Some were closed. Others were consolidated. The dealer network, which had once extended across the entire farming region, contracted as dealers went bankrupt or switched to competitors who offered better credit terms. The Depression forced Deere to make decisions that would have been unthinkable during prosperous years. The company had always prided itself on maintaining employment and supporting its dealer network, but survival now required cutting costs wherever possible. Factories operated at a fraction of capacity. Workers who had spent decades at Deere found themselves without jobs, and entire departments were shuttered. The Moline complex, which had employed more than 3,000 workers in 1929, operated with fewer than 1,000 by 1933. The company stopped developing new products. Engineers were reassigned or dismissed, and research projects were abandoned. Deere focused entirely on preserving cash and maintaining enough production to supply the dealers who remained in business. William Butterworth died in 1936, and leadership passed to Charles Deere Wyman, a great-grandson of John Deere. Wyman was 50 years old, a trained engineer who had worked in the company's manufacturing operations and who understood both the technical and financial challenges the company faced. He took control of a business that had survived the Depression but that had lost ground to its competitors. International Harvester, though also damaged by the economic collapse, had maintained its dominance through aggressive pricing and through its ability to offer farmers credit when banks would not. Ford had exited the tractor business, but smaller manufacturers had entered, producing inexpensive machines that appealed to farmers with limited capital. Wyman recognized that Deere needed to rebuild its product line. The Model D was still selling, but it was nearly 15 years old, and newer tractors from competitors offered features that farmers wanted. The Model GP had been replaced by the Model A and Model B, introduced in the mid-1930s, but these tractors were incremental improvements rather than innovations. International Harvester's Farmel remained the standard for row crop tractors, and Deere had not produced anything that could compete directly with it. Wyman pushed the engineering staff to develop new models that would incorporate modern features, hydraulic lifts that allowed implements to be raised and lowered without manual effort, rubber tires that replaced steel wheels and provided better traction and speed, and power takeoffs that could drive a wider range of equipment. The late 1930s brought modest recovery to American agriculture. Crop prices stabilized, partly due to government programs that paid farmers to reduce production, and partly due to improving economic conditions across the country. Farmers who had deferred equipment purchases for years began to replace worn-out tractors and implements. Deere introduced updated versions of the Model A and Model B, along with new models designed for specific tasks. The company also began investing in style designs, tractors that looked modern and appealing rather than purely functional. Industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss was hired to redesign Deere's tractor line, giving the machines a streamlined appearance with smooth lines and integrated fenders. The styled tractors, introduced in 1938, helped differentiate Deere's products from competitors and reinforce the company's image as a manufacturer of quality equipment. Sales improved, but the recovery was interrupted by World War II. The war created enormous demand for food, both to feed American troops and to supply allies in Europe and Asia. The government urged farmers to increase production, and it provided subsidies and incentives to do so. Tractor manufacturers were designated essential industries, and they received priority access to steel and other materials. Deere's factories, which had operated at reduced capacity throughout the Depression, now ran at full output. The company produced tractors, but it also manufactured military equipment, ammunition, parts for aircraft, and other material required by the war effort. The war years were profitable, but they also created challenges. Labor was scarce as workers left for military service or for higher-paying jobs in defense industries. Deere hired women to work in factories, a significant shift for a company that had employed almost exclusively men in manufacturing roles. Materials were rationed, and the government controlled prices, which limited profit margins. The company could not introduce new models because engineering resources were devoted to military production, and civilian tractor designs were frozen. Farmers purchased whatever tractors were available, and manufacturers had no incentive to compete on features or price. When the war ended in 1945, Deere and other manufacturers faced a transformed market. Millions of men returned from military service, many of them with savings accumulated during the war and with access to government loans for purchasing farms and equipment. The rural electrification programs of the 1930s had brought electricity to millions of farms, which meant that farmers could now use electric motors for pumps, grinders, and other equipment. Hybrid corn, developed during the 1930s and widely adopted during the war, produced higher yields and required more intensive cultivation. Farmers needed tractors and implements that could handle the increased workload, and they had money to spend. Deere responded by introducing a completely new line of tractors. The Model M, a small tractor designed for vegetable farms and small-scale operations, appeared in 1947. The Model R, a diesel-powered tractor intended for large grain farms, followed in 1949. These were not updates of existing designs but entirely new machines, incorporating technologies that had been developed during the war and that reflected the changing needs of American agriculture. The Model R, in particular, represented a significant advance. It was the first diesel tractor Deere had produced, and diesel engines were more fuel-efficient and more powerful than gasoline engines. The Model R could pull larger plows and work longer hours without refueling, which made it attractive to farmers working the large fields of the Great Plains. The post-war years also brought changes in how farmers purchased equipment. During the Depression and the war, farmers had made do with old machinery, repairing it repeatedly to extend its useful life. Now, with access to credit and with rising incomes, they began trading in equipment more frequently. A farmer might purchase a new tractor, use it for 5 or 6 years, and then trade it in for a newer model with updated features. This created a used equipment market, and it changed the relationship between manufacturers and dealers. Dealers now needed to manage trade-ins, assess the value of used equipment, and resell it to farmers who could not afford new machines. Manufacturers needed to ensure that new models offered enough improvements to justify the cost of upgrading. Deere capitalized on these changes by introducing new models at regular intervals and by improving the features that mattered most to farmers. In 1952, the company introduced the Model 60 and Model 70, replacements for the long-running Model A and Model B. These tractors featured live power takeoffs, which allowed implements to continue operating even when the tractor was stopped, and live hydraulics, which provided continuous pressure for lifting and lowering equipment. The improvements made the tractors more versatile and easier to operate, and they sold well. By the mid-1950s, Deere was selling more than 40,000 tractors per year, a substantial increase from pre-war levels. The company also expanded beyond tractors and traditional implements. Farmers were adopting more specialized equipment, combine harvesters that could cut and thresh grain in a single operation, hay balers that compressed loose hay into compact bales, cotton pickers that mechanized one of the most labor-intensive crops. Deere had not manufactured harvesting equipment on a large scale since the early acquisitions of the 1900s, and it had never produced combines or balers. Charles Wyman, still leading the company, recognized that Deere could not remain competitive if it only sold tractors and plows. In 1947, Deere purchased the Caterpillar Tractor Company's combined manufacturing operations, gaining the designs and facilities needed to produce grain harvesters. The company introduced its own combines in the early 1950s, marketing them through the same dealer network that sold tractors. By 1955, Deere & Company had transformed itself from a manufacturer of horse-drawn plows into a diversified producer of mechanized farm equipment. The company employed more than 15,000 workers, operated factories in multiple states, and sold products through more than 3,000 dealers across the United States and Canada. Revenue exceeded $300 million annually. Deere had become the second-largest manufacturer of agricultural equipment in North America, trailing only International Harvester. The gap between the two companies, however, was narrowing. Harvester, burdened by aging factories and by labor disputes, was struggling to maintain its dominance. Deere, meanwhile, was investing heavily in new products, modern manufacturing methods, and an expanded dealer network. The company was positioned to challenge Harvester's leadership, but it had not yet done so. The challenge came not through a single breakthrough but through sustained execution across every aspect of the business. Charles Wyman retired in 1955, and leadership passed to William Hewitt, who had married into the Deere family and who brought a different perspective to the company's management. Hewitt was not an engineer. He had worked in finance and administration, and he understood that Deere's future depended not only on building better tractors but on building a stronger organization. He restructured the company's operations, consolidating manufacturing facilities, standardizing production methods, and investing in automation. He also recognized that the agricultural equipment market was becoming global, and that Deere needed to expand beyond North America if it wanted to grow. Hewitt pushed the company into international markets, beginning with Europe. European farmers had traditionally used smaller tractors than American farmers, partly because European farms were smaller and partly because fuel costs were higher. Deere had to adapt its products to meet these different requirements. The company established manufacturing facilities in Germany and Spain, producing tractors designed specifically for European conditions. These tractors were smaller, more fuel efficient, and less expensive than the models sold in the United States. They competed against European manufacturers like Massey Ferguson and Fiat, companies that dominated their home markets and that had little presence in North America. The international expansion required substantial investment, and it did not generate immediate profits, but it established Deere as a global company at a time when most American manufacturers still focused primarily on domestic markets. By the early 1960s, Deere was selling tractors in more than 40 countries, and international sales accounted for a growing share of the company's revenue. The expansion also provided a hedge against fluctuations in the American farm economy. When crop prices fell in the United States, demand in Europe or South America might remain strong, and the company could maintain production levels by shifting output between markets. At the same time, Deere continued to invest in product development. The company introduced the new generation of power tractors in 1960, a complete redesign of its entire tractor line. The new generation tractors replaced the two-cylinder engines that had been Deere's signature since the 1920s with modern 4- and 6-cylinder engines that were quieter, more powerful, and more fuel-efficient. The tractors featured enclosed cabs that protected operators from dust and weather, hydraulic systems that were more responsive than earlier designs, and transmissions that offered more speed options. The new generation represented the largest product launch in the company's history, and it required retooling factories, retraining dealers, and educating farmers about the benefits of the new designs. The launch succeeded. Farmers responded positively to the new generation tractors, and sales increased rapidly. By 1963, Deere had surpassed International Harvester to become the largest manufacturer of agricultural equipment in the United States. The shift in market leadership was not due to Harvester's collapse but to Deere's consistent investment in product quality, manufacturing efficiency, and dealer support. Harvester remained a formidable competitor, but it had been slow to modernize its product line and slow to address labor problems in its factories. Deere, by contrast, had maintained relatively stable labor relations and had invested profits back into the business rather than distributing them entirely to shareholders. The 1960s and 1970s brought continued growth. American agriculture was consolidating. Small farms were disappearing as families left rural areas for cities, and the remaining farms were growing larger. Farmers who survived were those who could achieve economies of scale, working thousands of acres with equipment that allowed one person to do the work that had once required dozens. Deere's tractors and combines became larger and more powerful, capable of pulling wider plows and harvesting more grain per hour. The company introduced the 4020 tractor in 1963, a machine that became one of the most popular tractors ever built. More than 90,000 units were sold over a decade, and the 4020 established a standard that competitors struggled to match. The company also diversified into adjacent markets. Deere began manufacturing construction equipment, bulldozers, excavators, and backhoes that used many of the same technologies as agricultural tractors. The construction equipment business grew rapidly during the 1960s as the interstate highway system expanded and as suburban development accelerated. Deere also entered the consumer market, producing lawn tractors and other equipment for homeowners. These products used the Deere name and the company's reputation for quality, but they were sold through different dealers and marketed to a different customer base. The diversification reduced Deere's dependence on the cyclical agricultural market and provided additional revenue streams. By 1980, Deere & Company employed more than 60,000 people worldwide and generated more than $5 billion in annual revenue. The company operated factories on 3 continents and sold products in more than 100 countries. It had become not just the largest manufacturer of agricultural equipment, but one of the largest industrial companies in the United States. The trajectory seemed unstoppable, but the agricultural economy was about to enter a crisis that would test the company in ways it had not been tested since the Depression. The crisis began with a boom. In the late 1970s, grain prices rose sharply as global demand increased and as poor harvests in the Soviet Union forced that country to purchase American wheat and corn. Farmers responded by expanding production, purchasing land at inflated prices and borrowing heavily to finance the expansion. Banks, flush with deposits and eager to lend, provided credit on generous terms. Equipment manufacturers, including Deere, benefited enormously. Farmers purchased new tractors, combines, and implements, often trading in equipment that was only a few years old. Deere's factories ran at capacity, and the company expanded production to meet demand. The boom collapsed in the early 1980s. The Federal Reserve, attempting to control inflation, raised interest rates to levels not seen since the Depression. Farmers who had borrowed at lower rates suddenly faced loan payments they could not afford. Crop prices fell as global production recovered and as the strong dollar made American grain expensive for foreign buyers. Land values, which had been inflated by speculation, dropped sharply. Farmers who had purchased land at peak prices found themselves with debts that exceeded the value of their assets. Foreclosures swept through the Midwest. Thousands of farms were sold at auction, and entire communities were devastated. Equipment sales collapsed. Farmers stopped buying tractors and combines, and many could not make payments on equipment they had already purchased. Deere's revenue fell by nearly half between 1981 and 1983. The company laid off more than half its workforce, closed factories, and suspended dividends. The financial strain was immense, but Deere survived because it had maintained strong cash reserves and because it had diversified into construction equipment and consumer products. International Harvester, by contrast, did not survive. The company, weakened by years of poor management and labor disputes, collapsed under the weight of the agricultural crisis. Its agricultural equipment division was sold to Tenneco, which renamed it Case IH. The company that had once dominated American agriculture ceased to exist. Deere emerged from the crisis as the undisputed leader in agricultural equipment, but the industry had changed fundamentally. The number of farms in the United States continued to decline, and the farms that remained grew larger and more capital-intensive. Farmers demanded equipment that could work faster, use less fuel, and provide data that would help them manage their operations more efficiently. Deere responded by incorporating electronics and computer systems into its tractors and combines. By the 1990s, Deere equipment included GPS guidance systems that allowed tractors to follow precise paths across fields, reducing overlap and fuel consumption. Yield monitors recorded how much grain was harvested from different parts of a field, allowing farmers to adjust fertilizer and seed applications to maximize productivity. The integration of technology transformed agricultural equipment from simple mechanical tools into sophisticated systems that generated and processed vast amounts of data. Deere invested heavily in software development and data analytics, creating platforms that allowed farmers to manage their operations from computers or smartphones. The company also faced new competition from technology firms that sought to provide data services to farmers without manufacturing equipment. Deere's response was to tighten its control over the data generated by its machines and to argue that the integration of hardware and software provided value that standalone technology companies could not match. By the early 21st century, Deere & Company had become something its founder could not have imagined. The company manufactured equipment that used satellite signals, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to optimize agricultural production. Tractors operated autonomously, following pre-programmed routes and making real-time adjustments based on soil conditions and weather data. The company employed engineers and software developers alongside traditional manufacturing workers, and its products were as much defined by code as by steel. Revenue exceeded $40 billion annually, and the company's market value placed it among the largest industrial firms in the world. The transformation from a blacksmith shop in Grand Detour to a global technology and manufacturing company had taken more than a century and a half. The journey had been shaped by financial crises, technological revolutions, and the relentless consolidation of American agriculture. Deere had survived because it had adapted, investing in new products when old ones became obsolete, expanding into new markets when domestic demand faltered, and maintaining financial discipline even during prosperous years. The company that John Deere had founded to solve a single problem, prairie soil sticking to iron plows, had become the dominant force in an industry that fed much of the world. The green and yellow machines that worked fields from Iowa to India carried a name that had come to represent not just quality and durability, but the mechanization of agriculture itself. The technological transformation that defined Deere in the early 21st century brought challenges that had no precedent in the company's history. Farmers who purchased modern Deere equipment found themselves dependent on software that they could not modify and on diagnostic systems that required proprietary tools. A tractor that broke down in the field could not necessarily be repaired by the farmer or even by a local mechanic. The onboard computers that controlled engine performance, hydraulic systems, and emissions compliance were encrypted, and only authorized Deere technicians with specialized equipment could access them. This created tension between the company and its customers, farmers who had long prided themselves on self-reliance, and who resented being told they could not fix their own equipment. The conflict came to a head in the 2010s when farmers began advocating for right-to-repair legislation, laws that would require manufacturers to provide diagnostic tools and software access to equipment owners. Deere argued that the software embedded in its tractors was intellectual property, protected by copyright, and that allowing unauthorized access would compromise safety and emissions systems. Farmers countered that they owned the machines they had purchased and that they should have the right to repair them. The debate exposed a fundamental shift in what farm equipment had become. A tractor was no longer simply a mechanical tool. It was a computing platform that happened to pull plows, and the rules governing ownership and repair had not caught up with that reality. Deere also faced pressure from environmental regulations. Diesel engines, which powered virtually all large tractors and combines, produced emissions that governments increasingly sought to control. The Environmental Protection Agency imposed stricter standards in the 2000s, requiring manufacturers to reduce nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. Deere invested heavily in emissions control technologies, adding systems that injected diesel exhaust fluid into the exhaust stream to break down pollutants. The systems worked, but they added complexity and cost to the equipment. Farmers complained that the emissions controls reduced engine performance, and that they required additional maintenance. Some farmers, particularly those operating older equipment, avoided purchasing new machines specifically to escape the emissions systems. The consolidation of American agriculture continued unabated. By 2020, farms with more than 2,000 acres accounted for the majority of crop production in the United States, even though they represented a small fraction of the total number of farms. These large operations required equipment that could work efficiently at scale, and they had the capital to invest in the most advanced technology. Deere focused increasingly on serving these large customers, developing tractors with more than 600 horsepower and combines that could harvest more than 10,000 bushels of grain per day. The equipment was extraordinarily expensive, with a single combine costing more than $500,000, but the productivity gains justified the investment for farmers working thousands of acres. The company also confronted competition from unexpected sources. Technology firms, recognizing the value of agricultural data, developed platforms that collected information from multiple equipment brands and provided analytics to farmers. Startups created autonomous tractors and robotic systems that could perform specific tasks like weeding or harvesting without human operators. Some of these competitors had no history in agriculture and no manufacturing facilities, but they had expertise in software and artificial intelligence that traditional equipment manufacturers lacked. Deere responded by acquiring technology companies and by hiring software engineers at salaries that would have been unthinkable for a manufacturing firm a generation earlier. The company opened research facilities in Silicon Valley and other technology hubs, seeking to attract talent that would not relocate to Iowa. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 disrupted global supply chains and created shortages of components that Deere needed to manufacture equipment. Semiconductor chips, which controlled virtually every electronic system in modern tractors and combines, became scarce as demand from the automotive and consumer electronics industries overwhelmed production capacity. Deere's factories had orders for equipment but could not complete assembly because critical components were unavailable. The company prioritized deliveries to its largest customers and delayed shipments to smaller dealers, a decision that strained relationships but that reflected the economic reality of modern agriculture. The pandemic also accelerated the adoption of precision agriculture technologies, as farmers sought ways to reduce labor requirements and increase efficiency in an uncertain economic environment. By the 2020s, Deere & Company stood as both the beneficiary and the symbol of American agriculture's transformation. The company had helped create a system in which a small number of highly capitalized farms produced the majority of the nation's food, using equipment that cost as much as a house and that required constant technological upgrades. The green and yellow machines that dominated fields across the Midwest were marvels of engineering, capable of planting, cultivating, and harvesting with precision that would have seemed miraculous to the farmers who had first broken the prairie with John Deere's steel plow. Yet the system they enabled was fragile, dependent on global supply chains, on access to credit, on stable fuel prices, and on the continued willingness of farmers to invest in equipment whose complexity grew with each generation. The story of Deere was ultimately the story of American agriculture itself, a transformation from human and animal labor to mechanical power, from local production to global markets, from craftsmanship to mass manufacturing, and from steel and iron to silicon and software. The company that had begun in a blacksmith shop to solve a simple problem had become a multinational corporation navigating issues of intellectual property, environmental regulation, and technological disruption. What remained constant was the need to produce food, and the machines that made that production possible carried a name that had endured for nearly 2 centuries.